Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with part 2 on this 3-part video series for the 1/16 scale radio-controlled Israeli Tiran 5 tank. This model here is built for commission and belongs to a private collector. As I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. As I stated before, this is part 2 on a 3-part video series for this particular model. Part 1, I go over the model's condition at the beginning of the project, as well as I take you along during the model's construction. Part 2, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on the tank's external details and fittings, while in part 3, I'm going to be taking this model out for a test drive. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of content coming right at you. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the Israeli Tiran 5. The Tiran 5 is an Israeli adaptation of the Soviet T54 and T55 main battle tank. This is a very unique member of that tank family because this vehicle kind of came out of, well, necessity. So if we rewind our clocks back to the 1967 timeframe, right after the Six-Day War, Israel went ahead and captured a lot of Soviet equipment from the Arab countries that they went ahead and had the war against. This would include Egypt as well as Syria. Amongst the equipment that they captured was a large number of T54 and T55 main battle tanks. Rather than selling off or scrapping all of these newly acquired vehicles, the Israelis never look a gift horse in the mouth and decided to repurpose them for their own military. What the Israelis went ahead and did was they first simply just put and pressed the T54 and T55s into general service. However, shortly after that point, they decided to go ahead and make the vehicles more of their own. Basically, much along the same lines as they've done to the Sherman, the Centurions, as well as their Pattons. When the Israelis acquired these vehicles and pressed them into service, they went ahead and changed the name to Tiran. Again, much along the same lines as they've done with the Shot, which was the Centurion, and the Magach, which was the Patton. At first, the Tirans were nothing more than same vehicle, just under new management. However, shortly into the adaptation process, they went ahead and started swapping out some basic items. This would be things like the radios, so that the vehicles have NATO spec radios and they can communicate with the other vehicles that the Israelis were utilizing. After a little bit of time, the vehicles received even more upgrades, and by the time the vehicles received the Tiran 5 status, they were full-blown Israeli. At this point here, the vehicles had that whole road warrior aesthetics to them, and these were all done in order to configure the tank to better suit the Israeli military. One of the biggest changes that the Israelis made was with the main armament. The original Soviet main system was replaced by the L7. The L7-105 was utilized by other Israeli tanks of the period, namely the M60, the M48, and also the Centurion. The use of the L7 was a smart one because it is commonality amongst all the vehicles, and because of that you use the same ammunition and you don't have to have any strain on logistics. On top of that, the L7 was utilized because, frankly put, it was an excellent system, and even to this day the L7 is considered one of the best main armament systems for tanks and military vehicles. Some other mods were primarily done to the exterior fittings, such things as adapting MG mounts to use the Browning pattern and the FN pattern of MGs. We have a center-mounted M2hb mounted on top of the main trunnion, and you have a plethora of extra amenities scattered among the exterior surface, which would include storage racks, fire extinguishers, as well as jerry can holders, and boy are there plenty of those. Other modifications would include a newly designed front mud flap for one reason or another, and another addition was added to the turret, which was the use of a smoke grenade mortar. This was something that was also being incorporated on other Israeli tanks of this period. Oddly enough, of all the changes that the Israelis made, the one thing that they never messed with was with the vehicle's transmission and the engine. Those, they kept the old school original Soviet pattern equipment and never changed those out. The Tiran served with the Israeli military throughout the 1970s timeframe. They participated during the Yom Kippur War and, from several accounts, seem to have performed very well. The vehicles were eventually subjected to secondary status in the 1980s timeframe, where several of them were issued out to allied countries of Israel. You have Uruguay that received a number of them, and so did the Lebanese. Outside of that, the Israelis kept the vast majority of their Tiran 5 fleet. Most of the vehicles kept on getting upgraded in the decades that followed, where the entire tank portion was gutted out, and they were actually transformed into heavy armored personnel carriers. However, as they say in the business, that's a story for another day. Let's go ahead and take a step back to when I was converting this model from a T55 to a Tiran 5, because there are several bits of details that I need to discuss that are best done before the model is in its complete state that we have here. With the turret fully assembled, it's now time to add on all of the Israeli modifications, and one of the biggest, and arguably it's most important, done to the Tiran family was to swap out the main armament. Here we have the original T55 armament. This is the kit original piece, and it's actually a really nice component in its own right. It's made from CNC aluminum, it's hollow on the inside, it's nicely detailed. It's perfect for a T55. Problem is, this isn't a T55, or anymore anyhow, and this is going to be swapped out with the 105. The 105 L7 that I'm going to be using is this piece that we have here, which is a component that's 3D printed, and it has been listed on the ECA catalog now for a number of years. Oddly enough, I made this component years ago upon request by a fellow viewer out there who was working on a project similar to this, and he requested me to come up with this component, which I did. The ECA piece, in comparison, is made from a single 3D print, and it's made to work with the Hooben model. The only difference is with the way it connects to the turret. The original Hooben unit threads into this location, while the ECA one, there are no threads, so you do have to make a slight modification to the trunnion area on the Hooben kit in order for this piece to plug in. However, once it's installed in place, it's good to go. The L7 from ECA has the bore evacuator, along with all the collars that would be associated with this piece, and the appropriate detailing is also found on the muzzle end. From here, the piece is going to be fully primed prior to the installation on the model, which is why I'm taking the opportunity now to show it on video. A good number of the changes that were added by the Israelis are found on this fret that we have here. All these components are made out of HD 3D printed components. And here you get to see what they are prior to the installation. Starting with the biggest, which is the smoke mortar. The mortar itself, I was fortunate to find some really good reference photographs of this particular unit, so I was able to translate a large number of these details into the 1/16 scale counterpart. Specifically is with the top handle and gauge system that we have here. If you look at most of the smaller scale models out there, this is just rendered as a small little amorphous handle. However, the piece is far more detailed if you have the opportunity to see a real one. On the printing, you'll see that it has the appropriate geometry for the handle, as well as the gauge cluster, which is found on the inside. This is going to be way more appreciated once everything is fully painted. We have here the flange that secures the system to the side of the turret, and we have the ball end on the rear portion of the mount. There are no welds that are found on these pieces here. Because of the curvature of the T55 turret, this may require a little bit of hand fitting in order to get it to fit, so new sculpted weld beads are going to have to be added by the builder. This is true for not just this piece, but a few of the other components that are found on this fret. The next component are the two antenna bases that we have right here. The Israeli antenna bases are unique because they are adapting an American style of antenna base to work onto the T55 turret. And to do this, they went ahead and developed this large mounting base that would be welded to the rear side sections of the T55 turret. The components themselves are the 1/6 scale counterparts that I went ahead and scaled down to 1/16. They are integrally printed hollow, so you could have an antenna fitted in place. And also what's unique is that you have the spring detailing integrally printed on, along with the little rubber cover cap, which when the antenna is not fitted in place, you simply just pop it over to seal it up. Since these units are rendered to have the antennas present, the piece is just strapped to the side and dangle like the way you see here. once everything is fully painted and each piece is appropriately painted with the different type of materials that everything is, this will really give the model a very nice detail focal point. The next component is this large box that we have here. This gets strapped to the side portion of the turret right near the commander's cupola, and I believe this is what's used to store the smoke mortars, since it is mounted very close in proximity to the mortar itself. If I am mistaken, feel free to mention that in the comment section below, but from what I understand, I believe this is where the smoke rounds are kept. The next bit of detailing is this large bracket that we have here. This is the machine gun mount for the commander's cupola. The T55 commander's cupola did not have any armament found on it, and when the Israelis went ahead and captured these vehicles and started making it more their own, they wanted to fit it with as many machine guns as they possibly can. The machine guns, of course, would be Browning M2hb, which I will touch upon momentarily, but in order to do that, they needed to adapt the Russian cupola in order to fit their own armament, and that was facilitated by this very uniquely shaped reinforced bracket that we have right here. The machine gun mount is this little block, and the pintle will just simply drop into place. On that note, here we have the pintle mount for the machine gun on the opposite side of the turret. The Israelis did not utilize the Soviet DSHK, so in order to have the unit mount on M1919 Brownings, they needed to revise the entire pintle mount system, and that's what you see right here. This unit is just a simple bracket which gets welded to the side of the turret, and then the machine gun mount simply fits into this area over here and it can rotate. What's unique about the Israeli design, and it's vastly different compared to the ones found on other NATO vehicles or even American vehicles, is with the way the mount works. You'll notice that there are several holes that are present in this piece over here, and the unit is actually adjustable, where if you hit a spring-loaded latch, you can rotate the arm and it'll clip into place in one of these 4 locations, which you will see on the actual mount itself. Here we have the rotating mount. Notice on the rear portion over here we have the spring mechanism where you have that lever and you can pull up in order to adjust or, you know, swing the piece to its appropriate location. There goes the locking pin right over here on the rear portion. In addition to being able to swing, the piece is also extendable and can telescope, and that's facilitated with this tube mechanism here, and you can see the other locking point right there on the side. On the very end, this is where the 1919 cradle slips into place, and we have another little block over there which facilitates the lockup system. The last bits of detailing are these brackets and these tie-down straps that we have over here. These are secured to Browning M2hb 50 caliber barrels to the top portion of the turret, and they simply get mounted across the roof portion of the T55. On this portion over here, you can see that there's a little room for improvement, as when I was developing the piece, I kind of had the cupola bracket a little bit too close to the other bracket here, and the piece is kind of morphed into it. So this is something that definitely is going to be improved, and on the production units, this is something that you're not going to encounter. On this one here, I'm just going to delete these sections, so this one's going to be destroyed, but I do have an alternative set being printed right now to replace the broken piece that we have right here. The tie downs are nicely molded, and these footman loops just get mounted into their appropriate locations, giving you the complete detailing. The last bit of detailing that's found on this fret here are these 2 little straps, which they look like they're for a bin, and there's a reason for that, because that is another bit of detailing which is applied with this set. And that set is found right here, already mounted to the turret. Silly me, I forgot to record those bits of detailing prior to taking them off the sprue and fitting them to the turret. But basically, you have the following components. The first is this very large storage area found on the rear portion of the T55 turret. This is a big Israeli modification, and it's found on all of the Tiran 5 units. What's interesting about the piece is that it's made from a tubular skeleton, which is welded in place, and then it's skinned with a thin piece of sheet steel. The piece also has some tie-down or footman loops present on the top portion, as well as all of the welds which are on the spot weld type pattern. This is as per the real vehicle. With the way they are secured, they're actually fastened to the rear of the turret on fasteners, and you have these bosses which are welded to the tank, and then the unit just bolts in place. The straps have these little adjustable ovals cut into them just to make the alignment a little bit easier on the crews fitting them in place. There is some interior detailing, as you can see with the way the tube work skeleton is all laid out. One thing that is really interesting is this cluster of tubes that we have right here on the rear portion. I'm not really sure what these are for, but they are present on the real vehicle, ergo they're going to be present on the model. The pieces are, well, just two, or I should say 4 tubes that are cut to shape, and then they are welded in these following locations to form this cluster, and then they are bolted to studs that are welded to the rear portion here of the rack itself. The way you see on this model is as per the unit, and this is a single printing, by the way, so this is not something separate that you need to glue on. The tubes are printed hollow to obtain the maximum amount of accuracy. On the bottom portion, you'll see that there are 2 just tiny rectangle plates that are welded in these 2 locations, and again, this is something that I lifted directly from the real vehicle I was studying. On the same sprue, we have the side bin that's located right here adjacent to the secondary hatch. This component is a multimedia piece where you have some parts made out of the standard white nylon material, but other components are made out of the HD material. The bulk of the bin itself is made out of the white stuff, and just like with the bin on the rear, it is all present with its detailing, which would include the weld beads in their appropriate locations. And note on this one here, you have several spot welds along the bottom portion, and then there are these 2 continuous welds running along the front area. The top has a very unique geometry to it in order to contort to the T55's egg-shaped turret. And it also has the following fasteners, or I should say these, I guess, I don't even know what they are. They're these 2 bosses that are found on these areas. I'm not sure what they are for, but they are on the real one, so you can see them on this one too. The bin lid, though, is made out of the HD material, and this is to ensure the optimal amount of detailing that's found on the part. You'll see the opening handle with its mounting straps integrally printed on. We have here the hinge work, the hinge stops, along with the bracket mounts that are present. All of the weld beads are integrally printed on, again giving it some really good accuracy. You will also see 2 small holes integrally printed into these 2 areas here on the bin. These holes are mounting holes for those other latches that I touched upon that are present on the other runner. So you just simply install them in their appropriate locations, and you have the detailing complete for this piece here. The last component that's supplied with this set is currently not fitted to the vehicle, but you can see it right here in my hand. This here is a bracket type guard, and it is secured to this portion here of the turret, and it basically protects the mortar from this side of the vehicle. This is currently going through its installation process, and once fitted, you'll really get a good idea on what this piece looks like in place. But needless to say, the piece does have the detailing, which would be present on the real unit. Note the geometry here of the brackets themselves, or the support beams. It's got the appropriate shape to with the curvature here, and you'll also see sculpted or printed on weld beads in these 2 locations, as they would be found on the real vehicle. And here's the turret now fully transformed. At this point here, it is officially a Tiran 5. If I bring up the turret closer to the camera, you can really see and appreciate exactly all of the Israeli modified details that have been fitted to this vehicle. So outside of the ECA details that I touched upon before, the other fittings that I've secured on are the jerry can holders. The jerry can holders that are used by the Israelis are their own specific pattern and aren't shared by any other type of country. And the Israelis just love to sprinkle these things on all of their vehicles. I mean, it's just, they can never have enough of these jerry can and jerry can holders. The jerry cans themselves are also specific for the IDF and aren't similar to any other type of country, be it NATO or Eastern Bloc. And that is something I'm going to be touching on a little bit later on in the video. But for the jerry can holders, these are not found on the ECA catalog. These are actually off-the-shelf parts from shapeways.com. I have the link to these specific parts listed below. Securing to the vehicle was easy for some, and others required a bit of extra modification. The easiest one was the one that straps directly to the side here of the bin. This just gets glued directly to the other 3D printed Bissell that I talked about before. For the ones on the turret sides, you'll notice you have to do a little bit more scratch building. Because of the shape of the T55 turret, in order to get these things in place, the Israelis had to fabricate a bracket system in order to give the jerry can holder a bit of an offset. The holder itself is fabricated out of a thin strip of brass that was bent to shape and then secured to the model. For the lower portions, there are these studs that are welded onto the sides of the real T55 turret, and then these studs give the proper standoff as it did with the large bracket here on the top. The difference, though, is that rather than being one continuous bracket, there are these two tapped steel studs that are just welded to the side of the turret. The studs themselves are fabricated out of a length of plastic rod that was simply cut to shape and then secured on with the remainder of the details. This is true for the bins on both sides. A similar thing was also done to the storage rack found on the upper hull. Aside from the jerry can racks, the other thing that I scratch built were the spare track link holders. The Tiran 5 has 3 spare track links found on the turret, 2 here on the left-hand side, while on the right-hand side there's a single link mounted right over here. The way the Israelis mount their links is also unique to the Israelis. They basically just have these studs and straps that are secured to the sides of the turret, and then the link secures in place. The link secures in place via the track pin that we have right here and here, and once in place, the track link is permanently attached to the vehicle. Well, not necessarily permanently, but you know, when you need to take it off, it's easy to do so. On the model over here, I went ahead and permanently secured the track links to the side of the vehicle at this time. They are just held down with pins, and the way I fabricated the studs are I took plastic square stock, drilled holes into them, and then mounted them in place via the track link. I can take the track links off for painting, so this is something that will be easier done once everything is off camera, so that I could go ahead and paint everything separately, which will make it easier to go ahead and make sure everything is thoroughly painted. Some of the other fittings that I added are the light conduits for the main searchlight as well as the rear convoy light. The kit originally has these details, but they are molded in, and they are molded in on the softer end. So one easy way to enhance your build's quality is to delete the molded in ones and replace them with some sort of detail component. For this piece here, the wire is just a piece of wire, while the end cap, I recycled the one from my 1/16 scale Tiger 1 sets. That simply just was cleaned up and secured in place. On the one on the rear, I went ahead and used another small piece of wire, but for the connector, or I should say the point where it enters into the vehicle, on the T55 series is just this pill-shaped object, and this is where the wire emits from. For the one on the rear here, I fabricated out of the same piece of black plastic rod that I used to fabricate the standoff studs that I touched upon before. On a similar note, for the antenna wires, they mount into the vehicle externally, and the Israelis configure them in this type of format where we have this small little hockey puck style terminal block, and then the wire just enters into that and then enters into the vehicle. For the hockey puck block, I use the same black plastic rod that I literally just mentioned before. On the front section, you have the original antenna base mount plated over, as obviously this wasn't necessary anymore for the Israelis because they replaced the radio systems with a US NATO base variant. The next interesting bit of detailing is the vane sight. You see, the vane sight found on this vehicle here is from a Sherman tank, and that's not too surprising because more than likely the Israelis had a lot of experience with the Sherman's vane sight, and they probably preferred it. So when they were upgrading their T55s to Tirans, they took the vane sight from a 75mm or a 105mm Sherman turret. This is more likely the case because they had a ton of both of those pattern turrets on hand from the various number of Shermans that they acquired in the post-war years. The vane sights for the 75 and 105 pattern of Sherman turrets have to have a riser on them due to the shape of the turret, and in order to make it fit onto the T55, what they did was they shortened the riser stem. For the model over here, I basically did the exact same modification that the Israelis did on their real tanks. The vane sight is the ECA 1/16 scale 75mm Sherman vane sight. with the riser, and I just simply remove the same amount of material that they did, and the piece was then secured in place. Once fitted, it gives a nice little bit of detailing to the roof of the turret. From the vane sight takes us to these details that we have here. I'm not sure what they're for. I believe they may be used for 50 caliber barrels, but I'm a little hazy on the actual subject. If anyone does know, feel free to put that in the comment section below. But here you get to see the details fitted in place. I touched upon them before when I was talking about the other turret parts on the runner. One of the pieces, by the way, was integrally molded, or I should say printed, into this block over here. So what I went ahead and did was I had a replacement set printed up, and once it came in, I then secured it in the appropriate location. This was done to keep continuity. So here you get to see those brackets that are pre-welded, and they just drop directly in place. But you also get to see those little tie-down straps that I was touching upon before. Once they are fitted to the model, it gives you some excellent detailing. Also, there are several spares in case you accidentally break or lose one of these during the course of production, but you can also sprinkle them on to several of the other locations on the vehicle. Here we have the Israeli telescoping pintle mount. At the moment, it's not glued into place, so I'm going to be taking care of that as the build progresses, namely after it's painted and weathered. And on this side, you get to see what the cupola mounted version looks like. Here's that weird deflector guard that I was touching upon before. Note, lots of these fittings have added weld bead details added to enhance the accuracy and the detailing. The mortar is now in place. Again, it's a nice focal point on these Israeli tanks. And with the build coming to an end, the final cherry on top on any tank build is the turret-mounted MG. But with Israeli tanks, it is something that is taken to the next level. For the turret-mounted MGs, the Israeli tanks feature a M2hb 50, but also two other 7.62 MGs. On later Israeli tanks, you would see things such as the FM mag, but for this particular vehicle, you will tend to see them more often than not armed with Browning M1919s, but rechambered for 308 because NATO standardization. For this particular video over here, you get to see the mounts in question, and these are specific Israeli mounts that I tooled up for the Tiran 5. When taking on this project, this was something that I knew I was going to have to tackle because there aren't any other options on the market that give what the tank actually needs. I've seen a lot of other people attempt a Tiran 5 online, and basically what they do is when they hit this point here, they take the standard American MG mounts and kludge them on to fit on the Tiran 5. And this is something that just wasn't done by the Israelis. In fact, the Israelis had an entire different way of mounting their MGs that's specific to them, and it's something that if you don't do on your build, it's something that's going to be lacking and holding it back. Not to go too in-depth with the history of these pieces, but basically the Israelis featured a non-movable NG mount for a 50 and two multi-platform mounts for the 7.62 MG. These mounts on the real units can fit either an FM mag or the M1919, and this is why the Israelis opted to design their own special mount as opposed to using something that was USGI or were in use by other NATO countries. And not just is this the case for the Tiran 5, but it's seen on many other Israeli tanks such as the Magach, the Shot, and also the Merkava. Starting with the larger mount here, which is for the M2. The M2 that you see here is a non-adjustable mount. This thing is meant to keep the 50 in place in a static position, and this is done on purpose because this mount here is used to secure the M2 onto the trunnion of the main armament. The Israeli mounts are very specific looking because of just how garage and shop made that they are. These things have the Road Warrior aesthetics all over them, and it's something that again is unique to the Israeli tanks. The piece is all 3D printed in the HD material, as are the other two. And here you get to see the components that, or I should say the details that went into creating this part. First, all of the mount pieces themselves are made out of just round tubing that were welded together onto flat plates, and they were just fastened together with fasteners. All of these details, including the welds and fastener detailing, are present on the piece here. Of course, this is going to be more noticeable once the pieces are painted and fitted to the vehicle, but here you get a good idea on what they look like beforehand. On the top mount section that secures the receiver in place, it's made from a piece of channel, with the rear section lobbed off so that they can weld on a threaded piece of steel, and a threaded rod would then be secured in place and connected to the T&E mounts. This is something I'm going to touch upon in a moment. On the front portion, we have the front receiver section, which again is as garage built as you can imagine. And by the way, the details on all these pieces I actually lifted from real examples of the Israeli counterparts that I had really good references on. So basically what you see here is how they look on the actual unit. Directly welded to the square channel on this side, you can see a large box. This is to hold an ammo can, or you could just put the 50 ammo belt in this section over here, and it keeps it in place. There's no lids or other restraining equipment that's present on this piece here. This is held in place by these two brackets that are welded to the bottom of the box, and they of course are welded to the side of the square channel. From the 50 mount takes to the two 30 cal mounts. These look similar, however, they do have some differences with them. On the one for the Commander, you'll note that the cradle section is actually canted backward, while on the loader version, it's more reminiscent of a standard cradle mount. The actual unit itself that secures the receiver to the cradle is exactly the same between the two units. Only on the Commander one, there are these two other lugs that are welded on the rear for some other type of equipment. On both sides of the cradle, you'll notice that there are several perforations found in these areas, and these are to secure on either an M1919A4 or the FN mag. On this side over here, this secures the ammo can, and it's very reminiscent to the American cradles that have a bracket that's welded directly to this side, and the geometry of course needs to be different in order to accommodate this, while the geometry on the unit on the other side is designed to clear the charging handles that are found on both of those units. On the bottom portion we have the exact same type of pintle mount that's present on all the other cradles, and this is something just for standardization. So theoretically you can actually mount this on a World War II pintle mount and it'll fit on without any problems. Where things get really interesting on the Israeli mounts is with the ammo can holder, and this is something that is as Israeli as you can possibly get. No other country has an ammo can holder like this. The ammo can holder is very unique because unlike the American ones, which either just have the can sitting out in the open, has an arm that comes out and puts tension on the belt or some other mechanism like that, for the Israeli mounts it is something that is a bit more engineered. So you'll notice really quick that the geometry is very, very different. We have these two tall walls on either side, and the area is completely open on the inside as well as also on the bottom rear section that we have right there. The Israeli units have a cover found right over here, and this is something that is hinged and hinges outward in this direction. On the opposite side, we have a little latch that secures it in place, and it prevents the ammo can from shaking loose when the vehicle is in operation. On this side over here, we have this curved bit of metal, and this is a nice smooth ramp section so that the bullet belt has a nice easy flow from the ammo can into the feedway found on either MG. Of course, on the real units, the ammo can is removable as it is on the American units by simply just sliding upward, and you can take the whole mount off. However, for the model here, that's obviously not necessary, and the mount is also static, so it cannot move up or down. The way you see it is how the unit fits in place, and the model is in display mode at that point. Circling back to the Commander unit, like I touched upon before, the main section is canted in this angle, probably to give better access to the Commander to reach and utilize. And also the bottom portion here has this plate that you can see the piece welded to in this format. The units are both ready for painting and mounting directly out of the box, and no assembly is required. All three of these units come on a runner and they're ready to go. You just snip off the pieces and mount the MGs in place and you're good to go. So if you're watching this video, you're probably saying to yourself, okay, John, the mounts look great, but what are you going to mount into them? What source for an MG are you going to use? Well, when I was tackling this, I basically wanted to use something that was off the shelf and is something that is readily available. And at the same time, have something that's very nicely detailed. And I came to the conclusion, just like I've mentioned in the other 1/16 scale model showcase videos, to use 3D printed MGs that are found on shapeways.com. The links to both the M2 and the 1919s are found in the video description listed below. These units are excellent in quality and in my opinion are some of the best on the market in a 3D printed format. So for the M2 cradle, here we have the M2 that I'm going to be utilizing. As I touched upon before, this unit I've used on many other builds that are showcased on this channel for the same reasons. The piece is very nicely detailed and it's basically a drop-in install with the other cradles that are on the market. So for this one here, obviously this was going to be the unit of choice. The way the unit drops into place, you'll notice that there is a hollow pinhole for this section over here. However, it's not going to be really necessary. The M2 just drops directly into place like the way you see it here. However, there is one slight modification you need to make to the M2. That's on the bottom portion here of the receiver. You'll note that the original T&E mounts are integrally printed on. However, the location is not exactly where it lines up on the actual unit. So in order for accuracy and for simplicity, I went ahead and integrally printed the T&E mounts right here on the bottom portion, or I should say the top portion here, of the 50 mount. The units are scaled to work with this receiver, so all you gotta do is just polish these two pieces away with a needle file or some sandpaper, and then once the unit's painted, you just simply drop it into place like you see here. Once the unit is mounted and fully painted, you can see how it completes the look of the unit. For the Browning 1919s, I used this set that we have here, and what's really cool is that this set supplies you out of the box with two Browning 1919s, which is obviously ideal because you need two to outfit the Tiran 5. No more and no less. The stock Brownings are excellent with their quality and are more than suffice for the job at hand. You will definitely see this in better light after everything is painted and weathered. From here though, I am going to snip off the little runners just so I can test fit the piece onto the cradle to give you an idea of what it looks like once fitted in place. And after a few seconds with a clean cut snip, the unit is removed very cleanly, quickly, and most importantly, effortlessly. From there, the unit just drops directly into place. At this point here, you need to see which holes go where. The ones that are towards the front and this one over here towards the rear are for the FN mag. So these ones you want to ignore when you're mounting on a 1919. The 1919 holes are found, hopefully this comes out in focus, right over there, and are also right over here. Even on the inside here, you can see the spacers that are present on the real unit so that the unit fits in place as it should. From here, I'm going to pin it together with some thin sewing pins, just so you see how it looks like once mounted in the appropriate location. Here you can see the unit pinned in place, and the holes line up absolutely perfectly. So no other revisions or hand fitting needs to be done if you're using this MG paired with the ECA mount. One other thing I want to mention at this point here is if you look at the mount, you'll see these two little stems that run across the front and rear section. Now to the casual observer, they may look like sprues that need to be removed by the builder. However, that is not the case. These are present on the real unit and are actually used to bolt these two pieces of steel together, forming the shape of the cradle. On the model here, you leave them, you do not snip them for any reason. You leave them as is. There are a couple sprues holding the piece together. Both are found on areas well away from this section over here. The one sprue is located right over there. You can see the little belly button remnant that's left on the can holder. And the other one is right here on the bottom portion of the pintle. That's it. No snipping or any sort of modding or cutting needs to be done to this section here. So at all costs, don't mess with it. Just snip it and mount the MG and you're good to go. And once the pieces are pinned in place, by the way, the pins are included with the ECA set, you're ready for installation. And I think it's also safe to say that lately I've been designing a lot of cradle mounts, and I think I got a pretty good knack for it at this point. On top of the ease of pinning in place, you'll also see that the feed system is in line with the receiver, as it should be on the real unit. And again, there's no other mods that need to be made. One last thing I want to mention about the 50 mount is that you'll notice on this section here, it has this curvature piece. This is so that this piece can be glued to the inner trunnion found on the Hooben kit. Just make a little incision on the tarpaulin, add a little drop of glue in this guy here, and just wiggle him in place until he seats where he needs to go. Once in place, the installation is complete. Of course, you want to keep away from the barrel section because that needs to recoil. This goes on that white nylon component that the barrel slides in and out of. Once the piece is secured in place, the barrel can move freely, go up and down, and even recoil without there being any problems with this unit affixed to it. And with the model fully completed, you really get a sense to appreciate it in its final form. So starting with the suspension, here we have all of the running gear components. All of the parts that you see here are stock with the Hooben model, with the exception of the track, which is a replacement die-cast aftermarket track that is supplied and produced by Hooben. If anyone is interested in picking up any of the Hooben T55s, I strongly recommend opting for the die-cast metal tracks because they are excellent. Back to the suspension itself, the road wheels were removed from the model during the construction phase. Actually, it's probably one of the first things I did when I dig into a project. And in addition to removing the wheels, the rubber tires were removed as well. The rubber tires were not glued on by the previous builder, and this is something that I always do on my rebuilds, specifically on vehicles that have a rubber tire feature like this. It's best to paint and weather the rims without the tires in place because it does cut down on the complexity and it makes the painting process go by much easier. The rims are reapplied, and I don't use any super glue on the rims. It's not really necessary. The tires just go on, they slip into their appropriate locations, and with the way they're engineered, they actually hold together very well. You really don't want to use super glue on these fittings here because if there's ever a need to remove the rubber tire for one reason or another, either it gets damaged or something along those lines, it's much easier to remove it without the thing glued in place as opposed to when the piece is glued on with any sort of rubber adhesive. This is something that I've experimented with over the years. On some builds I have glued them in place, and on other builds I haven't. In by and large, from what I've seen, it doesn't affect anything performance-wise, but it does assist things when it comes time for maintenance. So that is something to keep in mind. Of course, the road wheels are attached to the die-cast swing arms via metal axles, and the wheels roll in brass bushings, much along the same lines that you'll see on the Tamiya models. The quality of everything is really nicely done, and one thing that I did on this build during the reinstallation is a common trick that I mentioned on my other builds is I take a swipe of grease and I add it to the shaft prior to the installation into the road wheel. This is great because it gives you a little bit of extra lubricant on the metal on metal areas where all the rotation happens, and it's just a way to improve the build's performance overall without really having to do that much extra work. During the rebuild, in order to get access to the center axle, the wheel is first removed from the swing arm, and then the hubcap here is popped off, allowing the axle to be removed. The hubcaps were of course glued in place, and most of them I was able to remove without any problems. Unfortunately, one or two of them were damaged during the extraction process and were not going to be able to be salvaged for this build. Wasn't a problem. What I did was I went ahead and made a mold of the Hooben hubcap so that when it came time for the reinstallation, I cast some resin replacements that were a drop-in replacement from the original plastic ones. Moving rearward takes us to the sprockets, and the same is going to be equally as true for the front idlers. These pieces are excellent, and the kit ones were simply just reutilized. The kit ones were removed off of the model. I gave them a thorough coat of primer, paint, and the weathering, of course. Then they were remounted to the model at the appropriate time. The detail fidelity on these pieces are exquisite. The quality of the materials are also nicely done. The material that's used to produce both the sprocket as well as the front idler is the same type of die-cast material that's used on the track, as well as the other swing arms and suspension components that I touched upon in the other video. These parts are so good that the need to scrounge or search for any aftermarket replacements is simply not necessary. The components are perfect to roll with out of the box. The only reason why you would even contemplate about swapping out, say, the front idler would be if you're trying to render an earlier version of the T55 or the T54, where the front idler had a different profile to the surface area that we have here. Note on this one, it has this little wavy type pattern, while some of the earlier T54s, the unit was just a simple straight type wheel. Outside of that type of a build, there's really no need to look for any sort of replacements for either of these components. One last thing that I do want to mention involving the sprockets is with the center hubcap. The hubcap, of course, is a plastic piece, and it covers up the entry hole for the fastener, which, of course, is customary on just about all the other 1/16 scale contemporaries on the market. But, as I often mention in these videos, the center portion here is a small little grease or a zerk fitting, and it's generally painted in red. This is true for not just the Israeli usage of the T55, or in this case the Tiran family, but also I've seen this feature on many Russian and com block examples of the T54 and T55 tank itself. So it's one of those things to consider, and it's a very simple thing to do with a little brush of red paint, just a little dab will do you, and of course it'll always help the vehicle in the end. From the tracks takes to the front portion of the vehicle, and this is where you're going to start seeing the Israeli modifications coming into light. So the first thing I want to mention is with the mud flaps. This is probably the biggest change that the Israelis made to the T55s. The T55 standard mud flap is this stamped steel fender that is round in its overall appearance and does have some structural support on the inside. However, when the Israelis did their own conversions to the vehicles, they went ahead and changed the design of the mud flaps to the ones that we have here. The Israeli patterns are more squarish in their overall shape, but what's really unique about them is with the front section that we have here. You'll notice that the Israelis added these rubber mud flaps to the front portions of the fenders. This is very similar to what you'll see on vehicles like the M48 or also the M60. These components here are 3D printed and are a new addition to the ECA product line. The sets comprise of the two mud flaps, the hinges, and the hatch lock that we have here. All of the components I mentioned are 3D printed. However, the set also comes with something that is not 3D printed, and that would be the front flexible sections that we have right here. These are made out of real cast rubber, but the masters that were used to create the molds are 3D printed out of an HD material. Because of that, the pieces are going to have some very crisp detailing found on them. Fortunately, when I was researching and developing these sets here, I had some really good reference images of the real Tiran 5 in Israel, and I was able to translate as many of those details as possible to the units that we have here. And that's not just true, of course, for the tin work, but for the remainder of the details I'm going to be touching upon in this video. With the pieces being made out of real cast rubber, they give a level of authenticity and realism that simply can't be matched by a standard hard object that is painted to resemble rubber. The pieces are as real as you can possibly get. In fact, these are their natural colors. The rubber is this black color, and there's no extra paint work required whatsoever in order to get them fitted. All you got to do is glue them to the appropriate locations and trim off a slight bit of material on one end, because again, as per the real units, these were basically hand cut to the appropriate shape. Some of the details I do want to point out first are on the rubber section. We have the rigidity ribs right here on the front portion. We have the other rigidity rib found on the bottom portion. However, there's also more detailing found on the inside. See, the mud flap is fully functional. And here you can see not only the remainder of the rigidity ribs found on the rubber section, but we have the mounting bracket as well as the reverse side of the fasteners. The other fasteners are integrally printed on this side over here, and here you can see the small little hex bolts. as well as a rigidity strap, and yes, even the small little spot welds are present on the printings. On the inside portion, I continued the detailing found on the real unit, where we have some more rigidity braces that are in this frame type setup. The frames are all made from wrought iron and would be spot welded to the main tin work itself in the location that you see found on the model. What's also really cool is that the ribs here have this angle to them, and there's a space in between the backs of them as they are on the real unit. The material choice was something else that I really wanted to be aware of. These pieces here are made out of the white nylon material as opposed to the HD. Because of that, they are much more robust and are rugged compared to the standard HD material that I've used on other details found on this model. Because of that, you can run this model and the risk of damage to these pieces here are minimalized. On the inner section here, we have a small little tab that again is present on the real unit, and the welds are included. Not to mention, there's a small little rigidity brace again found on the bottom with its welds. This little bracket here is also present on the standard Russian pattern of T55, and it is used to lock a spring piece of steel in the section over here that keeps the unit from flopping around. However, it's not uncommon to take a look at real T55s or Tiran 5s in that manner and see that these pieces are hardly ever pinned in place, or if they are, they're really mangled in one way, shape, form, or another. And I could attest why, because on this one here, they are always getting in the way. Every time I move the fender up and down, they get bent, they move a little bit. It's, again, true to form to the real unit. On this side here, you can see that it's a little bit better, but you can see that it could use a little bit of a torque just to keep the piece at bay. But again, what you see here is true to form to the actual vehicle. On the top portion here of the fender, we have a little bracket with a hole in it, and this is used to lock into this device that we have here to keep the piece hinged open permanently and to prevent it from flopping down. With the camera readjusted, you could really appreciate the detail work on the hinges. Note the weld beads are present on both areas. And here we have that piece of spring steel that I was touching upon before. The wire, by the way, is included with the ECA sets. And not only is the wire included, but with the way the system is designed, we have this locking system over here that has a spring and a little pull tab. The spring is actually a real metal spring, and the pull tab is just a piece of 3D print that's applied and it just plugs into the appropriate location. On the box itself, there is a small little bracket that again has its welds present, and this is actually what is the guide that holds the spring rod here in place. On the opposite end here, we have this really small half circle connection point, and again, this is on the ECA piece. Both of these pieces here are made out of HD materials because of the detail fidelity that is needed. Once everything is added in place, you get to see exactly just how realistic everything looks, and it really is one of the bigger focal points on this vehicle. From the tin work takes us back to the front armor plate, showing some of the other Israeli mods. One of which being the, what I like to call the Israeli license plate. Basically, all Israeli tanks, they have this black rectangular plate on them that have numbers either painted on them, or in this case, they are welded to the surface. The numbers, I believe, are just the tank's serial number, and that's why it is usually on in a permanent manner. Although some vehicles just have this purely painted on the surface, for this one here, I wanted to make it with the embossed version. This is a HD 3D component that is supplied with the ECA rear bustle set that I'll touch upon in a minute when I get to the rear portion of the vehicle. The piece just simply snips off of the sprue, gets attached to the location that we have here, and then the only thing you have to do as the builder is paint it in the format showing off the highlighted areas, which again is true to form to the real vehicle. While on the front, you can see the added weld bead that I added to this section over here. This is my typical sculpted weld beads that I use on many of my models, and this is important because I don't believe the Hooben model has this detailing present. Carrying on brings us to the headlight and the brush guard area. This was another area that was heavily changed by the Israelis, and it's another new addition to the ECA catalog. If we can recall, the original T55 pattern of headlight brush guards would have been this wrought iron cage type system. However, when the Israelis upgraded their tanks, they went ahead and replaced this with the format that we have here. One of the reasons because the blackout light, which is underneath this area over here, was revised from the Russian pattern one, or the com block pattern one I should say, to a NATO spec one. On the model here, I went ahead and designed the setup that we have present. This is all made from 3D printed components, and what's cool is I actually went ahead and incorporated a functional feature into this. You see, one feature that the Israelis added to their brush guards is that not only does it protect the lights from any sort of damage from the sides, but they also have this shield right here in the front. Probably they found that this area is really susceptible to damage from small arms fire or fragmentation, so they went ahead and devised the system that we have here. The shield just fits in place, and it's actually removable. So when it comes time for night running, you would simply just undo two fasteners, and this piece would lift off, revealing the headlights underneath. This setup here is purely an Israeli design feature, and it's not found on any other type of vehicles. In fact, if you see a T55 with several of these features on it, you're actually looking at a Tiran 5. So one thing I wanted to do on this piece was I wanted to have the piece be functional because the lights on this model are functional, as I touched upon before. So to do that, I went ahead and made the shield fully removable. The shield is not glued on in any way, shape, or form, and is removed from this section. And the best part about this is that I designed it in a way that doesn't require the use of any sort of fasteners. So this piece simply just plugs into this location, and then if you want to, say, run the model with the lights on, all you do is you simply grab the piece and you pull up on it. Once the piece lifts off, you now have the headlight and the blackout light detailing present underneath. What's interesting about the brush guard is that it has these two little arms that are integrally welded on the real unit, and they act as a guide and keep the bottom portion here of the shield from flopping around. It's a really nicely engineered piece overall. One other thing that's interesting that I want to point out is the back portion over here has some sort of a communication box inlet that is present, and it's welded on this extender plate. This detailing, of course, is all present on the ECA printing, and the printing is a two-piece printing. So no other assembly work is required. We have the main brush guard itself and the shield, and the piece just drops directly into place with, again, no mods or tools required. Before I depart from the front, brings us to the front splash guard area. Of course, the T55 has this iconic bit of detailing found in this area, which acts as a shelf, but more importantly, it's a splash guard. This prevents water from moving up the slope here and entering into the driver's hatch when it's open. The Russian, or I should say the com block patterns of this vehicle have this piece made from a plank of wood. This is true from several of the real T55s I've seen in person. However, when I was researching the Tiran 5, I noticed that this piece here was actually made from steel. It's just steel plate that's cut in the exact same profile as the wooden one and just dropped in place. This is important to point out because if you're building a Tiran 5 and you're going through the weathering phase of that build, when it comes time for this piece here, obviously you want to keep the kit original one, being, whichever scale you're working it. And when it comes time to weather it, you weather it as you would the remainder of the vehicle. While as opposed to a Russian tank, you would render it with wood type weathering as opposed to steel. Moving along takes this area over here where some of the detail fittings are Russian while many of the others are Israeli. Starting with this little cluster, these are running lights, and these are present on all Russian vehicles. These are beacons and basically act like those beacons you see on the side of a semi-truck on the freeway at night. They are two of them found right here, and there's another two found on the opposite side, not to mention on the back and even on the turret, which you'll see as the video goes on. When you're rendering these on any sort of Russian model, basically the little front dome section is painted in white. On the model here, the dome, I don't believe was present, so the detailing that you see here was added by myself, and it's fabricated out of a metal wire brad. Basically, all you do is you drill a small little hole into the center portions of these areas, and with a small little metal wire, or wire brad, I should say, you snip off the length section and glue it into place with the head remaining. When it comes time to paint, you simply paint the head white, and you're good to go. The next thing I want to mention is the jerry can and the jerry can holder. What's unique is that this is the only location on the hull that has a strapped jerry can in this type of format. The jerry can holder is the same HD 3D printed one that I purchased from shapeways.com that I touched upon earlier in the video. But here you get to see what it looks like fitted to the hull. Unlike the ones on the turret that are standing vertically, this one here, it's mounted horizontally, and it's done via these standoff bosses that are fabricated the same length of plastic rod that I touched upon before. It's also at this time I want to mention that there are a few options out there on the Shapeways store for 1/16 scale Israeli jerry can holders. However, this one here was the one that I picked because in my opinion it was the best detailed. What made this one stand out from the other ones was with the inner bracket that we have right here on the under portion. This is not just needed because it's there on the real unit, but it actually does serve a pretty good function. Without that inner bracket over there, this jerry can would not be able to be fitted in place in this manner and will be flopping around all over the place. So that's why this is the set that I recommend, and again can be found in the link in the description below. As for the jerry can itself, this is a new 3D printed component from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm going to be touching more about that as the video goes on because you're probably going to have some better camera angles when I get to the versions found on the turret. Really quick, here you get to see the side portion here of the jerry can. Note the standoff from the fender, and again, this is because of that inner bracket that I touched upon before. Moving to this section over here takes us to the following details. On the Israeli modified tanks, this area would have contained a small jerry can. It kind of looks like the big black one that I just showed, but it's a little bit smaller in size. Rather than tooling up that unit, I rendered this model with the jerry can simply not fitted in place. Because the jerry can's not fitted in place, I went ahead and secured on these footman loops that were spare from the other sets that I touched upon before. These footman loops on the real unit would be used to mount on canvas straps, and that's what would secure the jerry can in place. Even though the jerry can isn't present, at least the straps or the strap mounts are there, which again gives you some more detailing. Also, at this time I want to point out the siren that's located right over here. This is the kit supplied siren, and normally it's located on the tin work. Of course, when the Israelis went ahead and recycled this area for the jerry can, the siren was relocated to the under portion here of that round disc shape object that's found on the upper portion of the hull. Once the unit was mounted in place, I went ahead and fabricated the little power cable out of a small little piece of floor wire, again giving it some extra detailing. Moving further back on the tin work takes to this area, and this area was repurposed by the Israelis. On the stock Russian unit, this box would be closer to the turret section. However, when the Israelis upgraded the tanks, they went ahead and did some reorganization. The box was pulled outward to the very leading edge of the tin work, while the area behind it was actually used for Pioneer tools. The Pioneer tools that the Israelis would have mounted would have been standard USGI AFV tools like the ones you would see on, well, Sherman tanks. They were secured to the vehicle in the same manner with canvas straps as well as with footman loops. On this one here, I didn't secure on the actual tools themselves, but just like with the jerry can holder, the footman loops were added in their place. Again, giving you the nice little detailing edge that would be found on the real vehicle. At the very rear corner of the vehicle, we have this iconic large armor box fitted to this area over here. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this is called the oil storage box or something along those lines, and for some reason the Israelis figured that they need to incorporate that on their builds. The piece here is a 3D printed component, and it's found on the fender accessory set that I touched upon before with the fire extinguisher and a few of the other pieces that you're going to be seeing when I flip the tank to the opposite side. This entire unit here is made from HD 3D printed components, and what's unique is that this one here is actually fully functional. So you can see that the piece just hinges upward. The inside's nice and hollow as it is on the real unit. And the piece can just close in place. What's also present, of course, are all of the weld beads on the hatches. Even the hinges have the cutouts, which on the real one I guess are for fasteners, but you know, since it's welded, the holes are just left in place. The handle has its weld beads present, and you can see the latch detailing found right here on this side. And what's cool, or one thing that I noticed on the real unit, is that it is a mirror image on the opposite side here. What's also present are the standoffs, as well as the fastener details. Unlike the jerry can holders where the standoffs are made out of that black rod material, on this one here, that's not necessary. The standoffs are integrally printed onto the mounting brackets, and the weld beads are present as well. So the pieces are ready to go out of the box with no sculpting or any other type of fiddling that is required. The same type of feature is going to be found on many other components that I've added to this model that you're going to see when I get to the opposite side. On the very corner section of the model, we have more of those running lights. These are stock with the Hooben kit, but like I touched upon before, the little lens area was added with a wire brad. And here we have another one of those little communication connection boxes, like I touched upon before, that are found on the front brush guard. The piece is actually the same CAD file, just located in this area here, and found on a little bracket that again has all of its weld detailing present. On the very bottom portion here, this is another piece that is supplied with the fender set, and this is the rear mud flaps. The rear mud flaps were rubber and were again bolted to the metal tin work. What's noteworthy to point out is that this detailing is actually integrally molded into the Hooben model. However, since I went ahead and changed the ones in the front with rubber, I might as well keep the continuity and do the same things with the ones in the back. Just like with the ones in the front, these are molded out of a real rubber material, and the masters were HD 3D printed, so you'll see all of the bracket and fastener detailing that are present. The pieces are not just sold with the IDF Tiran 5 set, and are sold separately in case you want to upgrade any standard Russian or com block pattern of Hooben T55. You can go ahead and amputate the standard plastic molded in ones with ones that are made out of flexible rubber and have better detailing on the surface. On the rear plate, this is where we have some more iconic Israeli Tiran 5 modifications. The biggest thing that is clearly here is this giant storage rack that's present on the back. This is a 3D printed component from EastCoastArmory.com and contains not just the rack, but the footman loops that you see along the inside portion over here. These brackets that are found on both of these areas, which are used for cleaning staves, not to mention the footman loops for the cleaning staves themselves. In addition to that, this set also comes with the pry bar and the pry bar mounts. The pry bar itself is a unit similar to the ones found on American vehicles, but slightly different with the geometry. But again, all of these fittings are found on the ECA set. These components here are all HD 3D printed, with the main bit itself being printed in the standard white nylon material. In addition to the details that I touched upon before, some other details that are present are the drainage holes, which are found on the inside, the rigidity rib, as well as the mounting brackets. The mounting brackets are integrally printed on, so they are not something separate that you have to measure and figure out with the location. They are integrally printed to this piece here, so to install to the model, all you gotta do is line it up properly, drill 2 holes, and glue the piece in place. In addition to the brackets, you can see the welds that are found on the brackets, as well as the fasteners that are both on the exterior and interior portions as well. Along those lines, on the opposite side here, you'll see some more fastener details, because on the reverse side of the rack, you will see a small little storage box that is present. The storage box is made out of HD material and simply plugs into this location here on 2 integrally printed on holes that are found on the rack itself. One bit of detailing that is not present with the sets, but possibly might be something I could look into for a future update, is with these 4 areas that we have here. On the original Russian T55, of course, on the back section, there are provisions for securing on extended fuel drums. And obviously, when the Israelis didn't need those anymore, they simply amputated them in order to make room for their new accessories and their new equipment. Well, the pieces were just unceremoniously torch cut off, and shards of it are still remaining on the rear section, and that's what you see on the model here. These are made out of sections of Plastruct stock, and I just simply added the cut lines with a needle file. I went up and down those sections in various angles and depths, leaving for the appearance that we have here. Hopefully it comes out on camera, but it really gives a nice little bit of extra detailing to the piece. Luckily, lining the pieces up was not difficult because the Hooben kit already has the locations for the provisions of these pieces in place, so you simply just plug up the Hooben ones. Another bit of equipment that's supplied with the rack is the second Israeli license plate that's found right here on the lower section. This is just like with the one on the front end, just like with many cars out there, the Israeli tanks have a license plate on the front and another one on the back. Starting with the right-hand fender components, takes it to the telephone box. This is a Israeli modified component, and just like with many other Western tank designs, this tank has the provisions for a communication box found on the back that allows infantry to talk to the tank crew as well as with other important individuals. The component that we see here is specifically designed for the Tiran 5, and I don't believe is present on any other type of vehicle. What's interesting about the version on the Tiran 5 is that it has this cluster setup that we have here, and all of the details that are found on the real unit are present on the HD 3D printed part from ECA. This would include, of course, the geometry of the box itself along with the lid. We have this bolted on guard on the top with the indication light right there in the center. We have these really large clasp type details found on either side. The piece has all of its mounting points as well as the standoffs, and yes, the welds are present as well. The mounting shelf is integrally printed on. It's one piece, so no other work needs to be done there. The rigidity bulkhead is present along with the welds, and yes, there even is a secondary little telephone communication box plug right here, which is the same one found on the opposite side and also on the front. That was quite a mouthful, but it's not over there because on the back side here we have a provision for the power cable, which is concealed by this armored covered plate that we also have supplied with the set. This again is HD 3D printed. It has the fasteners, the standoffs, and yes, the welds present as well. The power cord detailing is there. Hopefully in the camera angles here you can probably see it. It's right in here. It's really hard to get the camera to focus in, but the power cable is present. That is also supplied with the ECA set, just a little length of electrical wire. With the camera moved to the rear side, you really get to see the detailing found on the opposite end. Of course, directly in front of the telephone box are the fuel cells. These are the kit supply ones, and no changes were made to them whatsoever. The previous builder did do an excellent job with the fuel lines, so I do want to give him a shout out on that. Not only did he get the fuel lines in the appropriate locations, but he also went ahead and used lengths of shrink tubing for the hose clamp areas. Again, a nice detail touch indeed. The pieces were simply painted, and the hose clamp areas were painted in black as they would be a black rubber tube on the real units. And the other thing to mention is just for weathering, the fuel caps here have the oil leakage and seepage type weathering effects that I generally mention on and utilize on my other builds. On this portion of the model, we have these two mounting brackets. These are provisions for securing on two tow cables. The Hooben kit does supply you with the tow cables, and they are actual real metal tow cables that would plug into these areas over here. However, for this model, I omitted them. The reason why I did that is because the vehicle is radio controlled, and these tow cables are a bit problematic with trying to secure in place, and because the model is radio controlled and does need to have the ability to have the upper hull be removed for an emergency scenario, having the tow cables on, again, it becomes problematic really fast. So rather than keeping them on this build, I simply just omitted them, but have the mounting brackets in their place, so at least the vehicle is still detailed. Moving towards the front of the model takes to this area here. So we have the fuel tank. There's nothing more to talk about. This is stock with the model, and the builder did a good job with the plumbing lines as I touched upon before. So again, a nice shout out on that. The next change, which is one that was done by the Israelis, involved these two boxes. This box here is the Russian pattern box, but it's generally found in this location. When the Israelis upgraded the tanks, they came up with this box that we have here, but they still recycled the original Russian one. So the Russian one was mounted in this type of location, while the new design one went right over here. This piece here is the ECA 3D printed component that was found on the other fender accessory runners that I mentioned before, with the telephone box and that large oil storage box. The piece, just like with the other sections, have all of the details present, from the lid details to the hinge details, latch, standoff points, fasteners, hookups, welds. all of those details are present and the piece is ready for installation basically off the runner. The other box over here is the kit supplied unit and was simply just relocated to the location you see here. Moving towards the front of the vehicle, we have these two caps right here on the top deck. These are stock with the Hooben kit and are nicely detailed out of the box. What these details are, well, these are your gas caps. This is how you top off the fuel on a T55. You undo a couple bolts and you have the filler spouts underneath. Admittedly, it's a bit slower compared to Western tanks, but this is how it's been done for the longest period of time, and it's still true on the T72, probably the T90. So if you ever wanted to refuel your T72 that you got from some Ukrainian farmer, now you know how to do it. The pieces are weathered in the following format, where we have the oil seepage and stain look, which again is customary on my builds, but if you add this detailing or these effects here, it's a nice way to really spice up your build. Moving upward takes us to the turret. I already touched upon most of these details earlier on in the video when I showed everything in its raw form, but of course now you can... Starting with the jerry cans, here we have the same HD 3D printed ECA sets that I touched upon before. Here you get to see them, hopefully in better light. The jerry cans are extremely detailed with all the appropriate details which would be found on the real units. The embossed pattern is present. I even went ahead and have the little identification tags which would be found on the actual units. Of course, it's fully legible. You notice you could read out the 20 liters ID tag, and hopefully you could be able to see this. Is it glued on? Yeah, it's glued on. On this section over here, there's a little Hebrew marking in a circle that's found right there, dead center, and again, it's fully legible. To get a better look at it, I'm going to go ahead and throw some pictures up on screen of one of the raw printed units so you get to see what the unit looks like in better light. Note, for this particular model here, I went ahead and used a slightly different printing outfit compared to what I usually use. However, I believe I'm going to be using them for the foreseeable future for these parts specifically. But of course, this is something that's subject to change. Here we have that box that I mentioned before, which is a composite of standard white nylon along with HD 3D printed parts. Once everything is fully painted, it just blends in together with one another, and the piece is nicely detailed out overall. Here you can see the spare track link that I touched upon before. Once it's fully painted and weathered, it simply gets repinned into the location that we have here. Along with the turret coax MG. The MG was, again, the Taigen flash unit, which more or less resembles an MG34. However, the SG43 is very similar in its appearance compared to the 34. So for this build here, it definitely pulls off the look quite well. Carrying on takes us to the mantlet, as well as the mantlet cover. This is the stock mantlet cover that comes with the Hooben model, and the Hooben kit is actually really nice that it gives you the tarpaulin. The tarpaulin is a nice nylon material, and it paints really, really well. The 50 that's located right here was secured to the trunnion, as I mentioned in the previous video, and in order to mount it in place, like I touched upon before, with an X-Acto, you make a small little incision in this location over here, and then the 50 mount just slips into the location and glues to the top portion of the trunnion. Once it's in place, the unit will move with the trunnion's elevation. Of course, there's a little bit of wiggle here with the barrel and the trunnion for the recoil, but you'll see that in more action once the model is turned on and I'm elevating and depressing the main tube. While on the topic of the tube, here's the L7 right here. Of course, this was one of the biggest changes made by the Israelis, replacing the Soviet-made armament with one that was NATO spec. What's interesting to point out is that the Chinese themselves went ahead and did a similar modification to their own Type 59s, but that's more or less a story for another day. On the reverse side, we have more of those track links that have been fitted in place, but here you really get to appreciate the detailing found on the smoke mortar. With the unit fully painted and weathered, all of those details that I touched upon before really come out very nicely. So here's that gauge that I was touching upon before, along with the handle. Note the handle is painted to replicate black Bakelite or some kind of a polymer material, of course, which is what would be true to form. The mounting bracket is painted with the color of the vehicle, which again is what you would want for this type of a fitting. And the piece is hollow, So you have some more detailing over there. Generally, there is a rubber cap that goes on the front section, but for this one here, I wanted to render it with the piece left open. The inside of the mortar, of course, is painted to look like chromed steel, which is what you would see on a mortar tube like that. Continuing around takes us to that other HD 3D printed storage box. And here you get to see the opposite side of the storage rack with the fire extinguisher mounted in place. Moving along brings us back to the antenna bases. These are the same units I touched upon before, but now you can see what they look like fully painted and weathered. On this model here, I rendered the antenna bases themselves with a different color compared to the remainder of the vehicle, just to give just a little bit extra color pop. Which, of course, is something that wouldn't be unexpected to see on the real vehicle. The pieces are painted with olive green, which is, again, customary for many of these type of antenna bases. Also, you can see here the little rubber cover that I touched upon before has been painted with rubber black. And it really does give some extra bit of detailing and extra bit of color to this model. With the camera readjusted, hopefully this comes out on camera, but the piece was not only painted with its rubber black, but the fastener that's right over here was painted with a little drop of brass paint, which again is true to form to the real units because the fastener would be a brass screw. One other thing I want to point out at this time is that the antenna wires that you see here are fitted in place, but they are currently removable. This is done for the sake of shipping because this model is going to a customer and I still have to ship it there. Making the antennas removable is a nice feature if you're going to be building a model in that type of format. Once the model gets to its final destination, the owner, if he so chooses, can go ahead and glue them in place. But me personally, I would just leave them unglued because if you ever have to replace them or if you ever are taking the model or moving it, it's a good idea to remove the antennas. It's just one less thing to snag. And this vehicle here obviously has a lot of snag points. So 2 less things to worry about is definitely something that is never a bad idea. Carrying along brings us to the top-mounted armament, starting with the 1919 A4. These are those HD 3D printed components that I touched upon before, and now that they are fully painted and weathered, they look awesome. The quality of prints on these units are exquisite, and again, they just really fit the bill perfectly. They really are the cherry on top of this sundae. The 1919 itself was painted in my usual format along with the weathering, and of course, with a little poof of flat black on the airbrush, I added to the front section over there just to give it that little bit of powder fouling. Of course, the same thing was done to the other 1919, the M2, and of course the mortar for good measure. Of course, these units here were the last bits of detailing fitted to the model, as they are in basically all of my tank builds, and once added, they really do seal the deal, and the model just looks excellent when finished. And that's it for the detailing, which takes us to the paint and the markings. For the model's paint finish, I went ahead and cobbled together my own mix of Israeli sand gray. The color itself I actually got from following the instructions that were supplied with the Tamiya 1/35 scale Tiran 5 model kit. You see, when I was working on this project, I was not working on one Tiran 5, I was actually working on 2. Because in order to help me design and scale up all of the components that I've touched upon in this video, I used the 1/35 scale Tamiya kit as a builder's aid. Well, in addition to using it to scale up all of the components that I mentioned, I also used it to cobble together the paint that was necessary in order to get this model fully painted. Once I had the swatch made, I had it mixed at the Home Depot, and I have a gallon of this stuff now, so I can build just about anything Israeli as I want. The paint is an exterior latex and was applied onto the model via the airbrush after the vehicle was thoroughly primed, as I generally mention in these videos. For the model's weathering, I utilized both airbrush and dry brushing techniques. Many of the airbrush techniques I've already touched upon on several videos on this channel, which would include the use of fading, washing, and filtering. However, where this build gets really interesting is with the markings. You see, this vehicle here has lots of markings strewn about on the surfaces, and basically every surface has some kind of interesting marking that is present. Well, generally when you're doing a build like this, you try to find some kind of a marking solution, be it with water slide decals or with dry transfers. Yeah, that wasn't the case with this one here. The markings on this model were applied via paint the old-fashioned way. So there's no decal work on here. Every marking on this model was applied via paint. Several of the markings, the bases were applied via mass, like the rectangles found here on the front, the vertical one and the horizontal one. These were laid out by putting pieces of masking tape in their appropriate locations and then applying via the airbrush. However, the actual numbers and unit markings themselves were all done via hand and a paintbrush. And that's the way it was done. The same thing was also done for the chevron right here on the top, as well as the iconic Israeli stripe that runs along the barrel here. One thing that's nice about using hand painting for this is that it does have a hand painted look to it, which is more than appropriate for this vehicle. If you ever seen one of these in person, the markings were applied basically in the exact same manner that I applied here. This is generally a technique that you'll see on my larger 1/6 scale builds where I utilize stencils and hand painting for the markings. And for 1/16, this is where really my cutoff is. I like using decals when possible for 1/16 models, but if the need be arises, hand painting definitely does improve the build quite a bit. It's something that adds a bit more difficulty because you're working in smaller scales and surfaces compared to 1/6 scale, but it does yield for some excellent results. Anything smaller, by the way, than 1/16, I'm not painting. It has to be done with a decal type system. But for this build here, the hand painted markings really do give just that much more authenticity to the build overall. And with that, that wraps up part 2 on this 3-part video series for the 1/16 scale radio controlled Israeli Tiran 5 tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being, well, part 3 of this video series, as well as the other smaller and larger scale content that has been posted on the channel in the past. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been shown on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be catching you all again on part 3. See you there.